Sebastian, so what do you think about the increasingly wide perception of the European Commission becoming a heavy-handed scrutinizer? Is that indeed the case, that the Europe's competition watchdog is taking deals more seriously?
There hasn't been an uptick in the regulatory oversight by the European Commission, but it's more a question of a number of very high-profile deals in recent years, which I think have given people the perception that there is, a stricter approach by the European Commission. I think the two best examples are probably the New York Stock Exchange Deutsche Börse transaction, which was blocked last year with much fanfare, and also the UPS TNT transaction, which was of course blocked this year. I think in both cases there were many reasons why they were blocked, but for the perhaps London-based observer who's not an expert in competition law, it may look as if the Commission is being tougher rather than that the deals are more complicated.
And so, okay, but what about the things that the companies could actually do to anticipate that there might be difficulties, there might be regulatory hurdles in the pipeline? How shall they tackle those? How shall they prepare?
Yeah. I think there's a few reasons why a deal can go wrong. The first one is, of course, if there are genuine competition issues. I mean, in some cases, a transaction where there's two companies becoming one, you could imagine that the Commission is not too keen. They have a pretty sophisticated analysis for these things, but in some cases there simply is a big problem which can't be overcome, because if you were to offer remedies, which is often what happens later on in the process, those would actually undermine the strategic rationale of the deal, which means that the deal is no longer worth doing. So in those cases there's frankly probably not all that much you can do, but there I think, again, as we just discussed in our panel, before you begin a transaction, it makes sense to think about what remedies you'd be willing to give, what is the European Commission likely to ask, and so on. And if you conclude before notifying that actually the chances of getting clearance are very low, you might want to think again. Other issues you face includes successful complainants. So in every deal, early on, you will have competitors and users of the products or services which the companies do, who are asked for their view on the transaction. And very often complainants, who we also sometimes help, they try to make a deal difficult, either because they want to, make the lives of their competitors difficult, or because they're interested in getting a certain asset as a disposal or a remedy. And as we just heard, this quite often comes at the end of phase one, which is the initial part of a process. Suddenly, when the Commission needs to decide whether or not to go to phase two, they get beautifully crafted economic and legal submissions from complainants explaining why it's problematic. And that, I think, can be a big problem. Then there is the running out of time. I think that's a major issue. On a number of cases where we've worked, we've seen that the remedy discussions late on, there was a need to go back to the board of a certain company to make sure that they were happy with the remedies, and every time that took a couple of days. And when you're in a process with a fixed timeline, that can be very problematic. And then I think there are simply some mistakes that companies can make. The process is mainly a sort of bureaucratic one, but there is some political aspect to it. And actually a lot of the times when we work on a transaction, it will be with economists and with lawyers. But where there's a political element, we try to advise on that and think about, who is the right person to talk to and when and why. Because having your CEO go in to talk to Commissioner Almunia on the first day of phase one, probably not the right thing to do, but there we go.
You mentioned that you've assisted third parties in the past, but what about situations where you actually have to advise clients, the deal parties, about how to go about the third parties making a lot of noise and making the deal difficult? Yeah.
I think you have to anticipate that. And there was a comment by a senior DG competition official recently where he said that, and actually Mr. Dijsselhofer on our panel just now mentioned that as well, that of course competitors and complainants are expected to have a certain view. So the Commission will certainly take that into account, and if a competitor says, no, this is a bad deal for these three reasons, they will certainly ask the merging parties' view on that. So I think it's the same for every part of the process. The earlier you can think about it, and the earlier you can think about who's likely to say what, and what is it likely to have as an impact, the better. I think ultimately in the conversations with DG Competition, it's all about credibility. If the merging parties have credibility, if their documentation is on time and complete and considered to be reliable, that will go a long way, I think, to making the process easier for them. Whereas if it's the complainants who are seen as the more reliable ones, then of course it makes life very difficult.
So it sounds as if the regulatory risk is not really a deal breaker. It's just a matter of getting the right advisors and anticipating the risks and getting them straight.
I'd say that regulatory risk is real, but you can do a lot to minimize it. I mean, if you have the right advisors, and importantly, if you bring them in on time, I think you can really maximize the chances of success.